All right, so my name is Valera. As you said, I work at Slack, and I'm here to talk to you about a little journey that we undertook last year, actually year 2022, to optimize our mobile release process. But before I get there, of course, I have to say that year 2023 is the year when we all discovered AI. And I don't know if you can see the text there, but anyway. It's AI is great. I'm actually very enthusiastic about it. But I think that sometimes we forget that there's other things that we can do actually, like process changes that affect our business actually in very profound ways. So I decided to make this meme. But then and I sent it to a few colleagues, and they're like, "Well, simple process change to ship features to X faster. What exactly are you talking about?" I said, optimizing mobile releases. And they said, well, it's not that simple, of course. So, and it's true. Everyone is right. But anyway, before I start out any project, actually, I like to remind myself that we, and by we, I mean developer productivity engineers or whatever you call yourself, we're here to help our teams ship features to users. We're not here to make even say development life cycles slightly faster or builds faster. It's all at the end of the day, it's in service of this. And when I think about the release process and maybe other processes in our organization, I think that as developer productivity engineers, we're actually very well equipped to undertake and kind of guide those changes. And a lot of times, actually, we end up ignoring them, and they end up being done by other people that maybe aren't as well equipped to make them happen. And as I said, this was last year, back when Twitter still existed, and I'm really sorry, but yeah, rest in peace. And I started all of my projects by consulting with the larger industry, and I was wondering how frequently, what was the state of the art, or how frequently were most folks releasing mobile apps to their users, and just spoiler alert, as Slack was doing at that time, the most common answer was every 2 weeks, followed by weekly, with some people slower than 2 weeks. So I'm actually curious to do a little poll here. How many of you release, if your company releases a mobile application, how many of you release it 2 weeks or slower? So raise your hand. Great. This talk is mostly for you. How many of you are releasing it weekly or faster? Great. This talk is also for you. Because maybe you can make some, more changes. Who knows? And I think it's always fun to look at the release process. I actually, when I started this project, I didn't know much about the mobile release process. It was just something magic that happened. And I just didn't realize all the opportunities for optimization that were there, and also all the constraints. Anyway, when I asked the question of how frequently you would like to release your mobile application, the most common answer was weekly. So that seemed to be kind of the standard. But I'm curious also about this. What about you? What do you think is the most ideal, cadence for releasing applications, mobile applications? So raise your hand if you think weekly releases are too fast. You wouldn't want that. You want it slower. Thanks for the honesty. That's awesome. I'm going to try to convince you otherwise, but we'll see. And then raise your hand if you think that weekly is good and that you'd rather have it weekly. Okay, a little more. I asked the same question in a group of, it's a Slack community for Android developers, and by far more people said that weekly is way too frequent. So it shows you that if you do a survey, you really you got to know what your user base is, right? Who's responding to the questions. And of course, developers would say, yeah, weekly is too fast. Kind of makes sense. And then this guy, Romain Guy, who works on the Android operating system, which releases once a year, he just said, user here, please stop sending me your updates. I just don't want them. So I asked for his permission to use that. And you can see that there's a number of developers, probably from the Android platform team, that said the same thing. So that's fun. But here's why, why we might want to consider moving a little bit faster. So this slide was actually given to me by a principal engineer at Slack who wasn't working on mobile, but I really like this analogy. So imagine if you're driving a car down the winding road, you could touch the steering wheel only once every 10 minutes. How fast would you be moving? And so a team's speed is a function of the frequency and quality of the feedback loop. So how quickly you can iterate with your users, how quickly you can get changes in front of them, get response back, and then make changes in response to their changes. By the way, this is the last car analogy in this slide deck, so we won't be doing car analogies anymore. And it turns out, Slack, for example, we have a desktop application, but it's just a wrapper around the web application. And on the web, you can realistically, within the same day, kind of release a feature, get feedback from users, maybe, if you really knocked on their door and said, hey, give me feedback, respond, to that feedback with another PR, land that, and have that PR go out the same day. So the Slack application on the web releases about 10 to 15 times a day, or they could potentially go up to 20 if they needed to. However, on mobile, back in 2022, you're looking at an iteration cycle of 40 plus days. And if you don't believe me, I'm going to kind of prove it to you with a few diagrams. So here's our release cadence. We were releasing every 2 weeks, and our release train duration was 11 days. So that means that if you land a change somewhere kind of in the middle of your, maybe 7 days before your next code freeze, it's going to go out right here. And maybe, it will take you a few days to actually, for users to install the update. By the way, did everyone receive the new Slack UI today? Okay, so maybe, you kind of feel this pain right now. And maybe you want to give some feedback, to Slack about that. So it's going to take a few days for us to gather that feedback and process it, right? And then at some point, we want to make some changes to address that feedback. Well, by that time, you would have already missed, the next release train is on its way. So you've missed that train, and you're going to hop on the next one after that, which gives you an iteration cycle of 46 days. And of course, this can be a little bit faster depending on if you land closer to the code freeze or slower if you land your change right after, the release branch has. And, 46 days is like my 10-year-old son would say, bro, what's going on here? So let's see what happens if we now switch to a weekly release cadence and keep the release train duration exactly the same. So again, we release, we kind of land our feature somewhere in the middle there. And what's going to happen is that not only are we going to miss the next train, but we're also going to miss the train after that. So release train number 4 will only end up landing in release train number 5, which, still gives us a win. We're going to have an iteration cycle of 39 days. 39 days, 48 days, okay, that's cool, but not that cool maybe. So this is why it's worth going, whoa, okay. All right, the midway is falling apart. By the way, this is a very nice, cozy space here. I hope you guys are comfortable. You need a drink? Okay. Drinks are out there. All right. So it's worth speeding up your release trains because look what happens here. If we cut down the release train duration to 7 days, you are going to still miss the next train. It's going to be very hard to catch that one. But you can catch train number 4, which reduces your iteration cycle to 28 days. And the difference between 46 days and 28 days, okay, means that maybe you'll be able to do 2 or 3 iterations per quarter versus 1 or 2. And for teams that are also especially driven by feedback and experimentation, that's a pretty big difference. So when we were asking, I was kind of asking myself the question, do we want to just release more frequently or faster? The answer was both. I think both were worth doing. Now, here's a thought. What if you reduce your release train duration to 3 days? Well, then, you might be able to catch the train after that, and then it's 15 days, and that's a game changer right there. We'll see if we can get there. So, of course, a a lot of developer productivity talks include this Dora framework screenshot, which I took from some Google website, and the screenshot, has some like glitches on the UI, so not my fault. It came like that. But what's interesting about this is that you can see that this is like heavily tailored towards the web, right? On mobile, here's where we started with a 2-week release cadence, and here's where we kind of moved to, after we optimized the release train schedule. So even though it's like very impactful, the Dora framework, might not be the best thing for mobile. Because mobile is different, right? Like here you are, you're sitting in your Android, or Xcode ID, and you're releasing a feature, landed in main, go get a coffee. On web, this change would be like on its way to the users, to their browser. But on mobile, sorry about that. On mobile, there's this thing called the App Store or the Play Store for Google. So mobile is different. App Store reviews take days, and sometimes you have to do multiple rounds of them. There are no fast rollbacks. Users are not guaranteed to install your update right away or ever. On Slack, we observe that, for example, we release on Friday. By Monday or Tuesday, 75% of the user base on iOS has installed the latest update. That's actually pretty good, but 75%, like not 100. So the cost of a mistake is high, and that's why we're very safety conscious. Like our balance between risk and safety is just quite a different equation on the web. So I hope I've made the case, why it's worth, for your organization to undertake this change and this effort. Now let's dive deeper into what actually you can do. Like, what are the parts, the moving parts that you can optimize? And here, I added these charts with sort of weekends and kind of like weekdays because that ends up actually having some really interesting implications. Before I started this project, I thought, well, who cares? Like, just days are days. But it turns out like people don't want to work on weekends sometimes, right? So it matters. But so for Slack, and this may look familiar to you, the release process includes testing, and I'll dive a little bit deeper into each of these. The release node process, string translation or localization, App Store review, as I mentioned already, and the rollout. So let's dive into each of these. In Slack's case, testing was, by the way, when I talk about testing here, the one thing I don't mention here is test automation. So test automation to me is like, it's kind of like a given. When a release branch is cut, all of our tests get executed. We don't like run special tests on the releases. In terms of automation, all of our tests run as PR checks. So that's like a line that we've been holding on mobile for a very long time. It's worked out really well for us. But that's still not enough. On mobile, we want to go a little bit further. We want to test on different devices, all sorts of stuff. So we hand off a regression test suite to a vendor. And this vendor happens to work on a weekend. So we hand it off to them on a Friday. We get results back by Monday. And then our internal QA team was taking 9 days to triage these results. At the same time, they were also doing some additional validation and validation of hot fixes. So these are cherry picks into the release branch for bug fixes that were found after the code freeze. Then there was a process of internal testing, so dog food, which is what we call kind of like bake time. Your application is just sitting there. Maybe some internal users are using that and finding bugs. And then we would also release one or two external betas. So these are users outside of this organization that get a kind of an early preview, and we can at least observe like crash rates there and maybe get some feedback from them. So all of that is involved in testing. But if we wanted to move to a 7-day release train, and I remember we start kind of rollout on Thursday and Friday to complete it within the 7 days, that means that testing had to shrink into at least 5 days. Here's how we did it. So the one very cool thing, when I originally started this project, I looked at this large testing chunk, this block that was taking 9 days, and I thought, oh man, like most of our effort is going to have to be centered around test automation and like making sure that we reduce the amount of testing that we do, like on the manual side. Well, it turns out our vendor had no problem like running our regression test suite. They could run even more if we needed them to. That was not a constraint that we had. So we kept the same exact vendor test coverage, and that actually like kind of reassured a lot of folks in the organization that this is safe to do. But what was interesting is that our internal QA team, they would receive these results on a Monday. And then, since they had like 9 days, they would just take 9 days. And so at first I was like, I said, what do you need to get this down to 3 days? And they're like, well, okay, we'll just do it in 3 days. I was like, why have you? Okay, all right. Well, cool, thank you. And then I later I asked, well, what can you do it like in 1 day? And they were like, yeah, sure, yeah, we can do it in 1 day. So right now they kind of like do it in 1 or 2 days. So sometimes all you need to do to optimize the process is just to ask people and kind of give them a little deadline. Then we moved internal QA validation of hotfixes to feature teams. So the manual QA team no longer has to do that. They, in fact, like afterwards, we kind of decentralized our whole QA team. So changes were made. The dog food is an interesting one. I'll touch a little bit upon that later. We had to increase dog food adoption to compensate for shorter period of dog food time. And finally, the releasing external beta, we used to kind of do it a little bit later so that we kind of like tested our version a little bit before unleashing it on external users. Well, we ended up just kind of doing it right after code freeze on Friday. And it's been fine. Like the build is actually stable enough to release to external users. And finally, there's this sort of like lower tolerance for late hotfixes that I'll touch upon a little bit later. In fact, right now. By the way, this is world premiere of this talk. I just finished it yesterday, so I have sometimes I just get surprised by the content of this presentation myself. But hotfixes are a very interesting kind of thing. And a hotfix, again, is something that like a change where we find a bug, let's say an internal dog food, and we want to cherry pick that change after the release branch. The release train is already on its way. But of course, what happens there is, well, if the change, is significant, we have to retest things. It's really highly undesirable to do this. With a 2-week release cadence and a duration of a release train of 11 days, if you found a a bug kind of like somewhere in the middle of your cycle, it was no problem. Like we had lots of buffer to take hotfixes. With a 7-day cadence and the next release train just coming really soon, finding a bug late may trigger another App Store review, as I said. And we can sometimes accommodate that if it's an important change. But, you have to keep in mind that like the next train is coming. So in this particular diagram, it's coming in like 4 days. So yeah, okay, maybe we'll still make that release. We'll have it go out, and then 4 days later, release another release to make Romain like really unhappy. But if we find it even later, well, what happens is that it's just not worth it. Like we will not, release 2 releases in like 2 days. And in fact, we can't do it. There's a restriction in the App Store that kind of prevents you from doing that. So what we end up doing is we end up just canceling the release train in that particular case. But you know what? The cool thing is that even if we cancel some release trains once in a while, it still goes out faster in the next release than it used to with the 2-week release cycle. So late hotfixes, are something to be avoided and something that we track very closely. And we become a lot more strict about hotfixes. But it's not the end of the world if once in a while we have to cancel a release train. Now let's talk about release notes. First of all, Slack has amazing people that write release notes. If you've never read Slack release notes, they're really fun. Like just go on the Play Store or App Store and just read them. They're very clever. They're witty, but they're also informative. And so users like absolutely love this feature. But often what ends up happening when you go to a weekly release is the release note process becomes kind of tricky, and people just give up and say, okay, updates and bug fixes and performance updates or whatever. And it ends up being not interesting. We didn't want to give that up. And one thing about the release notes is that not only do you have to like gather what went in there and have a copywriter kind of write the language, but it has to be translated to all sorts of different languages. And that has to be done in time by the App Store review. So, that's like a lot of things to do. So what we had to do is we had to start the collection of release notes sooner. And what ends up happening sometimes is that we don't make it in time for this release. So the release notes just go out the next time. So sometimes when you read the Slack release note, and it says like this bug has been fixed. Well, it was already fixed in the last release. We just kind of got around to notifying you right now. Now, string translation and localization. This diagram was actually a bit of a lie, because in our case, what we used to do was that string translation happened even before code freeze. Our automation was just set up to merge string translations directly into the main branch. And so what we had to do is, if you had a change that involved strings, they had to be translated by the time of code freeze happened. And translation kind of like took 2 days. So we would have a special string freeze 2 days before code freeze. So that means if you're working on UI and you have new strings, your lead time is even longer than 11 days. It's 13 days, actually. So we solved this as part of this project. This is the cool thing about this project, is that we had this opportunity to just revisit a bunch of things that we were doing that made no sense. So of course, we built some automation that merges string translations directly into the release branch, and no more string freeze. Yay, engineers absolutely love that. So App Store review, my favorite topic. As I already mentioned, the App Store, the Apple App Store review, it takes 1 to 2 days, and it's very thorough. I was talking to our release manager yesterday, and he told me that they actually read our release notes, and then they like test. They try to test the changes that are in the release notes, and if they can't, for some reason, maybe like the feature flag is not on for them or whatever, then they reject. So we get rejected like 5 times. The rate of rejection on Apple is 5 times that of Android, and it's infuriating, but also I guess maybe like the quality, there's maybe a higher quality bar there. It's arguable. On the Play Store, it's a little better. I think it's probably a little more automated, and it takes about 4 hours. It's less strict. But one nice thing is that both of these things can happen on a weekend. So like if you happen to sort of align with the weekend, you can kind of use that. But one very kind of interesting restriction is that you cannot have more than one submission and rollout happening concurrently. So if you're like rolling out one release and you want to submit another one, that's a no-go. You can't do that. And in our case, we were using the weekend. We kind of debated, should we move App Store review to the weekend and kind of like realign everything? In our case, we decided to use the weekend for vendor testing. So App Store review had to move to the middle of the week, to Tuesday and Wednesday, so that the rollout could start on Thursday. And finally, the rollout, standard thing here. I'm not going to like dive too deep into this. This is a safety valve, right? Like we roll out to 1%, then 50, then 100. We observe crash rates, error reports, and we can just stop it at any time. And in our case, sometimes if we're late a little bit and we want to finish the rollout by Friday, we started a little bit late, we can do it in 1 day. But we prefer 2 days to reduce the risk. And then, as I already mentioned, it takes even after rollout is complete, it still takes a few days for users to pick up the update. And some users probably never pick up the update. So coming back to this slide, is it possible to have a release train last for 3 days? Well, technically, yeah. Like if you just take a build from the main branch, you submit it to the App Store, and, maybe you do a little bit of lightweight testing concurrently. And if you find something wrong, you kind of like just cancel the release train. So technically it's feasible. In our case, it just wasn't practical. It wasn't pragmatic. So we stuck with the 7-day release train. Cool. So now, kind of like how the sausage was made a little bit. But part of this talk, the reason why I wanted to give this talk is that this particular project, I think, was for me, a very good example of how you can make a large organizational change and do it kind of in a thoughtful way, a change that triggers lots of fears and kind of concerns, and how you can kind of do it and have success still. So I wanted to talk about kind of like a little framework that I put together. This is similar to, I think, frameworks that maybe you've seen around like design thinking or things like that. But this is something that, I just kind of like came up with when thinking about how we did this project. And I really like it. I plan to apply it in the future. So first of all, the entire process, I think actually the keynote, you've heard that talking to folks, super important. Can't disagree on that. The one thing I want to say though, this is called, this conference has the word developer in it, right? And I think that my team is called developer experience. So we often just focus narrowly on developers. But it turns out there are other people in our organization. There are like product managers, and there are designers, and there are engineering managers, and there are executives, and there are program managers. And some of these people have a really large impact, and maybe, for example, overworked and kind of a bottleneck for how quickly features get out to our users. So I think I've been thinking about this. Like, I think our focus should become a little bit wider than just developers. I think it should be all of engineering. And when you talk to folks, oh, and by the way, the reason Steve Ballmer was there was because I started work at Microsoft in my career. And so this image of Steve Ballmer yelling developers is just burned into my brain, and I'll just remember that for the rest. But when you're talking to folks, I think what you want to do is you kind of want to suggest that, hey, we're about to make this change. What do you want to get out of this, and what are you afraid of? And in our case, the hopes were for faster iterations, more clarity on schedule, reduced pressure to catch the release train, better stability, and then the fears actually were really interesting. Lower stability with reduced test time was kind of a common one, but also some developers actually were very concerned, and I think this is the reason why a lot of Android developers in that community voted like that 1 week is too fast. They were concerned about increased pressure to catch the release train every single week instead of having to do it twice, once every 2 weeks. And then, we take these hopes and fears from our user interviews, and I think we turn them into success criteria. And, our success criteria is we want increased velocity and clarity, we want reduced pressure, not increased, and we want no regression and stability. And the next thing I think that's good to do after you talk to folks and you kind of like understand the problem a little bit from the perspective of a few is you want to pan out. If you have a larger organization, you can't talk to every single person. You want to give everyone an opportunity to give you feedback via a survey. The survey should be kind of based on your success criteria from the interviews, and it's really a baseline for human perception. What I love about surveys is that we can kind of it's an easy way to get a metric when you can't get a metric otherwise. So for example, for the pressure to catch the release train, how are we going to measure that with like an objective metric? Well, we can't, but it's really based on human perception. And so our survey, and I'm sorry, I don't know if you can read that text, but I'll read some of the questions, was based on the success criteria. So we asked folks, how strongly you feel the pressure to catch the next release train. Questions about schedule clarity, like is the release schedule clear to you? Questions about velocity to different audiences, and then safety. One of the safety questions that we'll talk about that. So that's just the survey. And at the end of the day, you get some numbers back. You also get some comments, and you can kind of like color code things, and you can kind of see where your hot patches are, right? What are people afraid of? What are their concerns? So let's look at these one by one. So first of all, on pressure to catch the release train, this was definitely there. And this quote just summarizes it really well, that people try to squeeze updates and improvements into the upcoming release because the next one is so far away that, by the time the customer sees our work, it's 1 month out, slows down this and that. I'm used to working with desktop where things are happening so fast, and mobile is just slow. So, and lots of folks like across all disciplines said the same thing. Schedule clarity was an interesting one. We discovered that, some people in our organization didn't even know that we had an external beta. So they were like, what are external beta users? What are you talking about? And then others were saying with this 2-week release schedule, sometimes you have a release on Friday and sometimes not. So it's a little bit confusing. And part of our hope was that switching to a regular cadence was going to make things more clear. On velocity, this was an interesting one. I expected people to be a lot more unhappy about velocity, but as we already saw, developers were actually quite satisfied with the 2-week cadence, but product managers and designers were not. So one developer said, other places I've been are even worse. So hey, Slack is fine. And then a designer said 2 weeks is a long time in the modern world of software. So give me those fast release cycles. And then the last one was a bit of a provocative statement. I really wanted to know, what is people's confidence in our test automation? And so I said, would you feel comfortable taking a build from the main branch that is green, where all the tests have passed, and giving that to external users, like without anything else? And you can see that, not so comfortable. People said we need a lot more automation before this can be done. We definitely will forever always need a regression test pass by manual people. I frankly don't know if that's true. I think, I'm a little more optimistic, but we'll see. We'll see if we ever get there. We're not there yet. The next thing is about instrumenting the process. So you have your survey, that's a good baseline, but you still want to gather some objective data, right? Like, what is your baseline for certain statistics? And we have a lot of great sources. We have GitHub, if you use that as source control. We have the app and Play Store APIs, which allow us to scrape data. We have our CI, we have human input, and all of that can kind of be wrapped into our tracing framework and uploaded to the data warehouse. And I'm not going to go into great detail here, but of course, like, the end goal of this is just to create a dashboard. And I'll get a little bit more into what is part of this dashboard next. But one kind of thing that I want to say is that sometimes with humans involved in the process, it can be a little tricky, like, how are we going to measure, like, how are we going to trace what the humans did? And of course, with another layer of indirection, anything is possible. So in our case, we added some, our QE team used to just send a message to Slack saying, I sign off for this build. Well, now we added a button to our CI. So right where that build is produced, you grab that build, you test it. You can say, okay, I signed off for this build there. We intercept that. We add that to tracing. And then all of that, we can like really literally trace like a PR, being submitted to the main branch and then eventually getting released to a user. So that was also another great opportunity for us when optimizing this process, like to get clarity into that. And so with our dashboard, we were able to focus on these things. Release quality. As I said, hot fixes are a pretty big concern for us, but also production patches. So production patches when the release has already gone out and you have to like kind of scramble and push out another build. As I said, no fast rollbacks on mobile. And as you can see here, well, I'm not going to get ahead of this as the success criteria, but that's on release quality. On the release speed, we were able to measure things like how long does App Store review actually take, how long does QE take to sign off, and all sorts of things that are involved in our process. And then kind of like, what is the lead time from when a change lands into the main branch to when it gets out. We also could like look at the number of pull requests per release, something that we had no idea before, and kind of how those pull requests are stacked in time in relation to the code freeze. So it's kind of interesting. Are people scrambling at the last minute to get their pull requests in? That is an interesting indicator. So now let's talk about mitigating risk. As I said, like a lot of people were uncomfortable with this change, right? And that's normal. One thing that really helps is making the change incrementally. So we decided to not bite off, too much at once. And we first staged it so that we increased our release frequency to 1 week, and then we increased the release speed. And at any given point in time, we can like decide to roll back one of these changes. Before we did the actual changes, our release team did a dry run. Like they went through all the steps of the process and they skipped the rollout, and they discovered some things that were not ideal, and we were able to make some changes based on that. And then feature flags. So you can give a whole talk about feature flags and how that mitigates and complicates things. But feature flags are not a silver bullet, but they are an effective tool in managing risk. Like if you're releasing code that's fully behind a feature flag that you can turn off remotely, that, you're going to feel a lot safer about that. And on the web, for example, a lot of developers lean into that. On mobile, I think they were leaning into that, but it's unfortunately very hard to measure. Like what is the percentage of PRs going in with code fully behind a feature flag? So I think like maybe we decided not to tackle that problem as part of our project, but maybe AI can help us there. Who knows? I have some ideas. Next thing is, as I mentioned, our dog food, the amount of bake time, sort of like the amount of time you have like, or the opportunity to catch bugs basically before they go out to external users, that's reduced now. So what we did to compensate for that is we made a push to increase dog food adoption. less time, more users, hopefully more eyeballs, catching more issues. So we had to do that on both Android and iOS, but especially on Android because there's just no Android users in our company. It's very sad. And then last thing is, instead of mitigating risk, we have to realize that there are trade-offs in life, right? Like we got into a certain comfort zone with this 2-week release cadence, and it's okay. I think the important thing in general in life is to kind of push the boundary to where you're feeling slightly uncomfortable. And maybe you're living a little bit dangerously, but you're still making progress, and also like not completely blowing everything up. So living with risk is really important too. Very brief about communication. Again, from the keynote, it's important to communicate. And then when you're making a large process change, again, I think one of the very important things is keeping it real. So making sure that people who tell you about their fears, you acknowledge that you heard that, and like you're saying, I heard you, and we're taking steps to mitigate this. You can take this also as an opportunity to educate people about the process. They may be confused. And finally, the emphasis on, hey, this is an experiment. It's okay. Like if our success criteria, we're going to keep ourselves honest. If our success criteria are not met, we can roll back. That makes people a lot more comfortable. So finally, we made our change. We switched from a 2-week release cadence to a weekly release cadence. And then we were ready to switch to faster release trains. And this, just this kind of interesting thing happened here. So remember, I mentioned that restriction on the App Store and Play Store not allowing you to have a submission and a rollout happening at the same time. Well, ends up if you have a slow release train and then the next one is coming that's fast, you're going to have a collision. So in our case, like during the switchover, we had to cancel the slow release train. Just if you're making this change in the future, keep that in mind. So finally, we've made our change. I think here it's really important not to go like too quickly and jump into conclusions. Change is hard. Sometimes like it takes time to adjust to the change. Your process may be a little bit glitchy. You can make some tweaks. Don't judge too quickly. Let it bake. I recently got into baking pizza. So yeah, it's important. Like the timing of how long you let it bake is very important. Is that showing up? Cool. All right. Very important. That's my favorite slide. Once you let it bake, now you're ready to eat your pizza and actually evaluate it on its merits. And so you do a post survey. So we distributed 2 surveys after the weekly release switch and then after faster release trains. And I have to say, I've distributed a lot of surveys in my life. This was by far the most satisfying survey ever. We were just like, everything was green. And some things were really like much more green than before. So people were just kind of like raving about how much better this is. And the thing that we were really worried about is developer pressure. It ended up, being completely like, I wouldn't say it's not a valid worry. It's just that in our case, it didn't pan out, thankfully. And then there was still the designer that said, a week and a half is still a long time. I want faster. That's probably the same designer. You're right. Yeah, I'm going to find out who they are. No, they're probably a very good person. The other thing we asked in this follow-up survey is, would you want to go back? By far, like no one, well, actually, we actually asked, would you like to keep this? And everyone just kind of like said, yes, I would like to keep this. So that was cool. Very satisfying. After switching to the faster release trains from the weekly cadence, the survey results came in and they were like, lukewarm, like slightly better. So not significantly worse. So that's good. Some people said, hey, I feel even less pressure because I know I'll get out faster. Some people were like, hey, as long as we're continue to feel confident, let's keep going with this. But one interesting finding was that the actual release manager who manages this program said, actually, the 5-day schedule, it works really great when everything goes smoothly. In practice, there are several pain points, and most of the pain points were on the release team. So yes, I think we found our kind of slightly challenging, like outside the comfort zone balance here, because not everything is going great. And I think, I really wanted with this project to push us to that edge so that we can continue to improve these things that are not working great. So finally, with our evaluation, um, success criteria, right? Like we have them for a reason. So increased velocity. We clearly, this was not a surprise. Things are getting out faster with weekly, with more frequent and faster releases. People are satisfied. They want to keep going. Increased clarity. We got really great signal on this. Weekly cadence, much more clear than every other week. We'll call that a success too. Reduced pressure, as I said, we blew that out of the water. Double success, kid. And finally, no regression and stability. I didn't, unfortunately, have time to pull together like app stability stats, but the number of hotfixes continues to be rather not super high, but we generally have one hotfix or a little more per release, but it didn't increase drastically. So we were totally okay on that front and nothing to worry about. But the most important thing is that after making this change, people actually, people from all over the organization started mentioning, oh my goodness, I just fixed this bug and then it got out a lot faster. Weekly releases are amazing. Or we had a director come to us and say, we did this very important launch and Slack really tries to align launches between platforms. And they said, if it was the 2-week release cadence, we wouldn't have been able to align with mobile. Mobile would have been somewhere later. But with this change, we were able to release everything at the same time. And that's the most important thing, is this kind of anecdotal evidence that things are, in fact, much better. So triple success, kid. So finally, when we decide, we're going to celebrate or roll back, of course, celebrate. And we were all, celebrating from home. It's really sad, right? After post-COVID, these we used to have these celebrations, but we haven't gotten there. So are we done? I don't think so. I think there's still opportunities. When thinking about this DORA framework, can mobile get here? Well, probably not. But I think there are opportunities to be creative and to sort of have faster feedback loops. So first of all, we can iterate much more effectively with audiences that are not behind the Play Store. So these are key stakeholders like executives. In the number of times that people build a feature and they put a lot of effort into it, and then it gets to, it used to get to Stuart Butterfield, the CEO, and he would just say, you can redo, and it's so that could have been done much sooner. Iterating with internal users. We're now part of this company called Salesforce. They have 70,000 plus employees, and we have a lot of internal users that we can tap into, and we haven't done that yet. And also external beta users. I think we can lean a lot heavier into feedback from these wonderful people. Shifting left is really important to reducing risk of hotfixes. And again, if we ever get to that point where we can just take a binary from the main branch and release it directly, send it to the Play Store for review, we can have a 2 or 3 day release train, and that would be amazing. We can also optimize the time to detect and fix things, right? Remember, the iteration includes the time to detect and fix. This is something that we haven't really looked at yet, so it's still coming down the pipeline. And of course, as we just found out probably from the other talk, AI will fix all the things for us. Anyway, so just want to leave you with this thought that change is hard. Organizational change that involves lots of stakeholders. I think with a good approach, thoughtful approach, by talking to people, by surveying them, by taking it kind of step by step, change is possible. We can get out of our comfort zones and hopefully come out on the other end feeling a little bit more productive, shipping a little bit faster to our users.